Welcome to the Holistic Health Guide podcast. I'm Kathryn Berg, a certified classical homeopath with over 20 years of experience. In this episode and the next, we will be discussing remedies for back to school. At the time of publication of this, it's a little bit early for back to school, but now is the time to make sure you have the remedies you need on hand to be on the alert for any of these issues that we will be discussing. Today's focus is on test anxiety. It isn't just kids who get nervous when they need to take a test. Adults do too. So just because you have no young children doesn't mean this episode doesn't apply to you. You could have some exams you have to take for continuing education credits, for example, or go into graduate school. So there's all kinds of reasons that adults get tested as well. In this episode, we will be discussing the most common remedies for test anxiety. And if you stick around until the end of the podcast, you will learn about a particular remedy that is not well known, but will be the only remedy that can help if these are your test anxiety symptoms. So let's get started. Have you ever wondered how your favorite holistic health practices really work? Are you curious to learn more? Welcome to Holistic Health Guide. I'm Kathryn Berg, a classical homeopath with over 20 years of experience. Join us as we explore homeopathy, stem cell activation patches, the Enneagram, and much more. Let's dive in and uncover the secrets and tips behind your favorite holistic health modalities. Before we get into the remedies that we are going to learn about in today's episode, we're going to talk first about some definitions of anxiety. And these definitions are from professionals that I have found in various places on the internet. The first definition is that anxiety is both a mental and physical state of negative expectation. Mentally, it is characterized by increased arousal and apprehension, tortured into distressing worry, and physically by unpleasant activation of multiple body systems, all to facilitate a response to an unknown danger, whether real or imagined. And you can think about these multiple body systems. I mean, you could sweat, you could have to use the restroom, you could sleep poorly. There's all kinds of multiple body systems that could be affected by anxiety. There are cognitive feelings of dread in anticipation of some bad outcome as well, and physical sensations such as jitteriness and a racing heart, and they're all designed for discomfort. Anxiety is a purpose, and it is meant to capture your attention and stimulate you to make necessary changes to protect what you care about. Occasional bouts of anxiety are natural and can even be productive. Anxiety can be considered the price we humans pay for having the ability to imagine the future. A little bit more about anxiety. It is not the same as fear, but they are often used interchangeably. Anxiety is considered a future-oriented, long-acting response, broadly focused on a diffuse threat, whereas fear is an appropriate, present-oriented, and short-lived response to a clearly identifiable and specific threat. One could look at test anxiety as a fear of failure, but not everyone's flavor of fear of failure is the same. And you will see that there is often a physical reason why people have test anxiety as well. So, to learn about the following remedies: Anacardium, Gelsemium, Lycopodium, Thuja, and zinc, or Zincum, as we call it in homeopathy. An unusual remedy at the end of the episode also be talked about. And of the 6 remedies that we will learn, 4 of them are plants and 2 of them are mineral. There are no animals in this list, but that doesn't mean there are no animal remedies that cover test anxiety. They just aren't as common. And a common theme in animal remedies is survival. So it certainly could come up in an animal remedy if your life depended on you passing a test. But we're not going to get into any of those remedies in this episode. Let's get started with these remedies. The first remedy we're going to talk about is Anacardium oriental, or just Anacardium. The background of Anacardium as a constitutional remedy is that the parents don't allow the children to make any decisions on their own. As a result, there is an extreme lack of confidence. And I can tell you that I have given this remedy many times, and I have given it for test anxiety. And the people who need it prior to tests may not have parents who don't allow them to make a decision. But there could be, for example, a cultural expectation of success, as was the case for one of my clients. But it's also important to note that when growing up, tests were not a problem for this client. But the test was a major exam to get into graduate studies. So the weight of the test brought up the anxiety. The child or adult can become nervous at any situation where he might have to do something on his own and worries about getting punished somehow if he doesn't live up to these expectations. This could be a problem. Could be his own expectations as well as his parents. So let's not forget that we set them on ourselves sometimes. You can see that if a child has a lack of confidence and the consequences of not doing well on an exam are looming large, this remedy could be very helpful. Constitutionally, this person who needs this remedy is often not a particular nice person, but it is not always true, of course. Someone who is normally a nice person might need anacardium if they become mean and cruel in anticipation of an exam. The next remedy we'll talk about is Gelsemium sempervirens, but we'll just call it Gelsemium. It is the remedy most suggested for test anxiety by those who know a little bit about homeopathy. Gelsemium, as a constitutional remedy, gets very apprehensive in the face of ordeals. And if you think about what kinds of tests could be considered an ordeal, think about an exam that has huge consequences, such as a bar exam or a college admissions test. Those could be considered ordeals by those taking the test. Of course, any test could be an ordeal for the person who needs Gelsemium. Sometimes the anxiety comes just before the test, and sometimes it comes when studying for the test. And this remedy would likely be helpful just before the test. The people who need Gelsemium have to be able to withstand very difficult and very trying situations. That is their mindset when their test is an ordeal. So they can look very strong and brave and they try to maintain control. The opposite situation is when they can't maintain control and they appear as very cowardly. So I share a story about Gelsemium. Um, Many years ago, my husband and I took our boys to Washington, D.C. to see the monuments and museums and such. And when we went to the Smithsonian Museum of American History, there was a Civil War display. That display was very large, had a sized bottle of Gelsemium in it. It's labeled Gelsemium 30C. By the way, those pellets would probably still work as remedies don't expire, in spite of what your vials might say. The reason it was in this display is because the Army used to give soldiers Gelsemium to get them to go back to the battlefield. As you can imagine, combat would definitely feel like an ordeal, and the experience of it could feel very out of control and make one cowardly. The feeling of being out of control and cowardly could also be the experience of the person who needs Gelsemium to prepare for and take a test. So it isn't about failing the test, as in anacardium. It is about getting through this test. It is about this really big thing that they have to overcome. The next remedy to discuss as it relates to test anxiety is Lycopodium clavatum, or just Lycopodium. Homeopaths all learned that Lycopodium at one time was a huge tree, but over the centuries, it became a small club moth. And this represents the humiliation of Lycopodium. I used to be this big deal, and now I'm not a big deal anymore. As a result, they are generally ambitious. And the main theme of this remedy is to reach the top of the ladder, to reach the highest rung. One could think of President Bill Clinton when one thinks of this remedy. Doing poorly on a test would be humiliating for Lycopodium, as it would reflect poorly on their ambition. Our next remedy is Thuja occidentalis or Thuja. And it's a pretty well known remedy for skin conditions, but it has specific mental and emotional symptoms that make it a good test anxiety remedy. One of the main themes of Thuja is the feeling of being fragile and frail, and this extends through all the conifers. Conifers are evergreens, and they all have this fragility to them. I might shatter if I don't do well on a test, or they do emotionally shatter if they don't. But they also feel that there is something wrong with them, that they are weak and they are flawed. There are other remedies that fall into the same miasm that feel like they are flawed in some way. We won't talk about them today. If you want to learn more about miasms, listen to season 1, episode 3. The person who needs Thuja thinks there is this flawed part of him, and he has to cover up the bad part of himself. And religion might be used to do this in a more constitutional type of setting. A test situation would make a person who needs Thuja for test anxiety fear that people would realize something was wrong with him because he couldn't get the test right. What if his teacher thinks there is something wrong with him, or his friends or his parents learn how poorly he did, and then they'll see his flaws? And of course, they anticipate this outcome as well. Thuja is a 4 on a scale of 1 to 4 in the symptom of ailments from anticipation. So it is definitely a remedy that could help in preparing and taking it. The next remedy we're going to discuss is the remedy Zincum metallicum, or just zinc. And the main theme upon zinc is that they are going to be attacked. As a result, they are anxious, nervous, and twitchy. They have this they have constant anxiety, and they feel like they have committed a crime, that they will be arrested. They can be so exhausted from being anxious, jerking, and twitching that they can't even think clearly to answer especially a question on a test. Zincum metallicum has a very interesting symptom that we haven't actually discussed yet, and it is this, that when you ask them a question, before they answer the question, they repeat the question back to you, and then they answer the question. It would be a really interesting thing if you started to notice that about somebody who was preparing for a test and they started to act that way. I think a little bit about people who might be actually better off with a test that is oral versus a written test. And those might be zinc people, because I'll bet asking the question back, or having the ability to ask the question back, would help them do better on a test. So just something to think about. Another symptom of zinc is that it has canker sores, and they come up when they're nervous and anxious, which is a lot. So think about someone who might get canker sores while studying for a test or preparing for a test. And if you see that coming on, think about Zincum metallicum as a remedy to help calm them down before the test. I hope that you have found the extensive information on these homeopathic remedies to be helpful for you. Actually, I always hope that no one ever needs a remedy for these situations. But the fact is that some people just need more support getting through exams in school. So why not make it easier by administering a well-chosen homeopathic remedy? As promised, there is one more remedy that is rather unusual. And if you have the symptoms that match this remedy, nothing else will help. But before we get to that remedy, I was thinking that you might find it useful to have this information in a handy printable summary. You can print out the summary of the test anxiety remedies that we have covered and keep it stashed with your homeopathic remedy kit. If you keep it with the kits, you won't lose it. You should consider a notebook or folder for any future download. If you'd like to download a summary of these remedies, go to testanxiety.us. Just fill in the information and click the button. You'll be taken to a page where you can download the PDF file. Again, that summary can be downloaded at testanxiety.us. testanxiety.us. One word, testanxiety.us. Finally, the last remedy, picric acid. This is a really interesting remedy. And as I stated, if you or your patient has these symptoms, nothing else will help. The person who needs picric acid has stretched her intellectual capacity far beyond its limits. This is someone who has studied too much, studied and studied and studied and studied, and they just can't study anymore. This could, by the way, be someone who has simply worked too many hours as well. However, if this is chronic behavior, you should contact me for a constitutional remedy. The organs used to learn, eyes for reading, forehead for thinking, hands for writing, and tongue for speaking, are exhausted, and she needs to be quiet, rest, and take time off. But there is a test coming. I just can't take time off. How am I going to do well on this test? When they are in this failed state, they are sluggish and dull and can't think clearly. I want to talk a little bit about acid remedies now. All the remedies made from acid when they are in their failed state are exhausted. And there are lots of acid remedies. One that is more common is phosphoric acid, which was initially quite helpful for COVID, by the way. All acids, when they are on the other side of the acid spectrum and have a lot of energy and have a go, go, go mentality, it's one side, but that's not particularly helpful either. The mid range, where they have enough energy to do what needs to be done, but also have boundaries so they don't burn out, is more healthy. But in the failed state, they can't think clearly, so they can't study. An interesting side note about this acid is that when you ask them to rest, they might get really angry. No, I have to study. That is because there is nitrogen in this remedy. And nitrogen, as you may remember from chemistry class, is a very explosive element. Their test anxiety is related to having made tremendous mental effort that they now have brain fatigue. A dose or two of picric acid 30C will bring them back so they can study again. Just resting is not necessarily get them back to a condition in which they can study. I hope you have found this episode on remedies for test anxiety helpful. Remember, these remedies aren't just for kids, and they could also be useful in work situations. Next week, we will be presenting more remedies for back to school. And don't forget, if you would like a handout with these remedies summarized, be sure to go to testanxiety.us and download it from there. If you liked this episode, be sure to subscribe or follow, whichever your listening app calls it. And if you do like learning about homeopathy and other modalities, be sure to tell a friend who might also be interested in learning more. People find out about holistic health anxieties most of the time. Until next week, this is Kathryn Berg. Stay healthy and happy.